The darkness below. The old clock on the wall ticked with the kind of determination that only time seemed capable of. After 71 years, Martin Decker felt every second that passed by. Every second of silence, every weighty tick that echoed through his empty, sprawling estate. On the outside, the home was regal and well-preserved, nestled just outside the small town of Willowridge. But for Martin, the house wasn't just a home. It was his fortress, his kingdom, and within its walls, he harbored secrets that, if exposed, would tear his life apart. When Martin made his way to the hospital that cold autumn morning, he wore his usual look of feigned concern, perfected over the years. By his side was a young woman, her hair limp, her skin pale and translucent in the fluorescent light. She was stooped and silent, clutching her sides with frail hands. Her appearance stirred a mix of emotions in the staff. Dr. Evelyn Marks, the attending physician, watched them approach, noting with curiosity that the young woman looked ill but strangely calm, almost resigned. "Mr. Decker," the doctor greeted, glancing between Martin and the girl he introduced as his granddaughter, Caroline. But as Dr. Marks examined her, an uneasy feeling took root. Caroline's arms were bruised, her hair thin, and her body far too fragile. She looked at Dr. Marks as if searching for an answer, a question lingering in her eyes that went unasked. Though she claimed to be only 20, her eyes betrayed a lifetime of suffering, an age that went far beyond her years. As Dr. Marks continued her examination, she felt the tension rise. Caroline's gaze kept drifting to the door, and the way her hands clutched her hospital gown suggested she was battling some invisible force within. What was this young woman so terrified of? And why did she act like she hadn't seen sunlight in years? Outside the exam room, Martin sat stiffly, clutching a leather bag and looking down at his hands, the worn wrinkles of his fingers visible under the fluorescent lights. Every now and then, he'd glance at the door, impatient and nervous. Dr. Marks emerged, asking for Martin to join her in a private conversation down the hall. She kept her voice low and controlled, her every word measured. "We need to run a few more tests on Caroline," she said, watching Martin's face closely for any sign of recognition or concern. "Her symptoms are severe, and I want to know if there's anything in her medical history that might explain her condition." Martin's expression hardened. He was quick to deflect, claiming his granddaughter was merely frail and that their family had a history of weakness and sensitivity to light. But his evasive answers only heightened Dr. Marks's suspicions. "May I speak with her alone?" Dr. Marks asked, not really waiting for his permission. Martin hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Of course," he finally replied, though the coldness in his voice was unmistakable. Returning to Caroline's room, Dr. Marks pulled a chair up beside the bed and offered her a comforting smile. She tried to establish a sense of calm, to convey that this was a safe space. But Caroline's shoulders remained stiff, her eyes darting to the door as if afraid that her grandfather might return at any moment. "Caroline, can you tell me a bit more about your health?" Dr. Marks asked gently. "Anything at all would help us understand what you're going through." Caroline seemed to shrink back at the question, her eyes watering as she stared down at her hands. Her fingers, thin and white as bones, clutched the edge of her gown. Her voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. I don't know," she stammered, as if unfamiliar with the sensation of her own voice. Dr. Marks leaned in, her expression softening. "It's okay, Caroline. You're safe here. If there's anything you need to say, you can say it here." Tears began to form in Caroline's eyes, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words seemed lodged in her throat. Finally, she glanced toward the door, her gaze long and lingering, as though expecting someone to burst through at any moment. And then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered, "I don't think you believe me. No one ever would." But Dr. Marks wasn't ready to let her close up so easily. She reached out a hand, placing it gently on Caroline's shoulder. "Try me," she urged softly. "I promise, I'll listen." For a moment, Caroline looked as though she might speak, her lips parted and trembling. She glanced at the doctor with a desperate look that held years of anguish. She leaned in closer to Dr. Marks, dropping her voice to a low murmur. "Down there," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He kept me down there." Dr. Marks felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't pull away. She tightened her grip on Caroline's shoulder, trying to communicate that she was there, that she was listening. "Down where?" Dr. Marks pressed gently, trying to keep her own voice steady. Caroline swallowed, a shiver running through her as she clutched her own arms. "In the basement," she whispered. "All those years. No light, no windows. Just walls. And him." It took Dr. Marks a moment to fully process the meaning of Caroline's words. She felt a wave of nausea, her mind racing to make sense of what she was hearing. Could it be true? She stared at Caroline, trying to comprehend the full horror of what the young woman was telling her. "We'll get you help," Dr. Marks whispered, her voice shaking as she tried to suppress the storm of emotions swelling within her. "You're not alone anymore, Caroline." But Caroline shook her head, the despair in her eyes deepening. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice laced with a mix of fear and resignation. "He'll never let me go. Not truly." Outside, the hall was silent, but Dr. Marks knew she didn't have much time. She would need to gather the authorities, contact social services, and begin an investigation. But first, she needed to keep Caroline calm, to assure her that there was hope, that they were about to turn a page in this horrific chapter of her life. "You're here now," Dr. Marks said firmly, forcing a sense of determination into her voice. "And I won't let anyone hurt you." In the hallway, Martin Decker waited, his face as calm and cold as stone. He had spent decades crafting the perfect mask, hiding the darkness within him behind a veneer of respectability. But as Dr. Marks returned, her face flushed with emotion, he felt a momentary flicker of doubt. He realized, as their eyes met, that something had changed. The doctor knew, or at least suspected, that something was very wrong. Yet he straightened his tie, offering his usual bland smile. "Everything all right with Caroline?" he asked, his voice smooth and untroubled. Dr. Marks forced herself to remain calm, to keep her expression neutral. But inside, she was seething. "We're going to run a few more tests," she replied coolly. "You're welcome to wait outside." Martin's smile wavered, just for a second, but he nodded, hiding whatever emotion had momentarily surfaced. As she turned back into Caroline's room, Dr. Marks closed the door softly behind her. Feeling the weight of what she had learned, whatever this man had done, whatever horrors this young woman had endured, Dr. Marks vowed that she would uncover the truth, piece by piece, no matter what it took. Caroline's eyes met hers again, filled with a fragile hope. For the first time in years, she dared to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, freedom was within reach. Uncovering shadows. Dr. Evelyn Marks closed the door to Caroline's room quietly, her pulse still racing from the young woman's chilling confession. She took a steadying breath and made her way down the hall, mentally planning her next steps. Her first instinct was to notify the hospital administration, but this case felt different, urgent in a way that demanded immediate action. Caroline was in grave danger, and Dr. Marks couldn't shake the feeling that every second counted. Outside the room, Martin Decker sat patiently, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His face held an expression of mild irritation, like a man annoyed by an unexpected errand. Dr. Marks didn't look at him as she passed. Instead, she headed straight to the hospital's small administrative office and placed a call to Detective Sarah Lawson, a seasoned investigator she'd met while working on another case involving domestic abuse. If anyone could handle a situation this complex, it was Sarah. Within minutes, Detective Lawson arrived, her face set in a look of calm professionalism that only hinted at her sense of urgency. Her short, clipped steps brought her to Dr. Marks's side, and she wasted no time diving into the details. "What's the situation?" Detective Lawson asked quietly, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. Dr. Marks explained what Caroline had shared, carefully relaying every word and noting Caroline's fear of Martin Decker. "I'm convinced she's been kept captive," Dr. Marks whispered. "I can't say for how long, but based on her health, it's been years." Detective Lawson's jaw tightened. "Where is this Martin Decker now?" "He's waiting just down the hall," Dr. Marks said, her eyes flickering in the direction of the lounge. Without hesitation, Detective Lawson turned, her face hardening as she walked toward Martin. She approached him with the casual authority that often caught people off guard. "Mr. Decker?" Detective Lawson began, keeping her tone neutral. Martin looked up, his expression slightly confused but polite. "Yes, is something wrong?" "We need to ask you a few questions regarding your granddaughter's health," Detective Lawson said, the slight emphasis on the word granddaughter making Martin's brow furrow. He hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he nodded, following her to a private area where she could question him without interruption. As he sat, his usual confident posture returned, and he crossed his arms, looking at her expectantly. "Can you tell me a bit about Caroline's living situation?" Detective Lawson asked, keeping her tone even. Martin hesitated, and for the briefest moment, his gaze faltered. She's delicate. She's had health problems all her life. Her mother passed away years ago, and I've taken care of her ever since." Detective Lawson nodded, scribbling a few notes. "And her father?" "He abandoned them both," Martin replied curtly, his tone laced with bitterness. "I'm all she's had." Lawson studied him for a moment. "I see. And where does she stay when she's not in the hospital?" Martin's face hardened. "She stays with me, of course. She's too frail to live on her own. I've provided everything she needs: food, shelter, medical care." Lawson noted the defensive tone in his voice. "Has she ever had any social interactions, friends, education, or any kind of connection outside of your home?" Martin's expression shifted, and Detective Lawson caught a glimpse of something dark lurking beneath his calm demeanor. "She's special," he replied, his voice dropping slightly. "Fragile. I couldn't risk her being influenced by outsiders." His words sent a chill down Detective Lawson's spine. She had met men like this before, men who hid behind masks of propriety, only to reveal their true natures in moments of self-importance. Martin Decker wasn't merely an overprotective guardian. He was a man accustomed to control, a man who believed his authority was unquestionable. "You must care about her a great deal," Lawson said, testing his reaction. Martin smiled, a thin, cold smile that held none of the warmth of genuine affection. "More than you can imagine, Detective. I've sacrificed everything for her." Lawson leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Sacrifice. Can you tell me more about what that means?" Martin's face hardened again, and his eyes grew steely. "It means that I have taken every precaution, every measure, to ensure her safety and well-being," he replied with a slight edge. "And I don't appreciate the implication that I would do otherwise." Lawson nodded, unfazed by his shift in tone. "Of course not, Mr. Decker. It's just that Caroline's health has raised some concerns. We want to make sure she's safe and properly cared for." Martin stood abruptly, his face flushed with irritation. "Are you accusing me of something, Detective? I've given that girl everything she needs. And now she's being taken care of here in this hospital, isn't she?" Lawson stood as well, meeting his gaze evenly. "Yes, she's in good hands, but I'd still like to follow up with some additional questions." Martin's jaw clenched. "Then I suggest you make it quick," he muttered before turning on his heel and striding out of the room. Detective Lawson watched him go, her eyes narrowing. She didn't miss the undercurrent of anger in his voice or the way he refused to acknowledge any responsibility beyond what he saw as his duty. It was the language of a man who saw people as possessions, and it sent her suspicions into overdrive. When she returned to Dr. Marks, she relayed her impressions, her voice grim. "We'll need to secure a search warrant for his property. If this young woman has been held captive, there will be evidence. I'm almost certain of it." Dr. Marks nodded, relieved. "She needs help, Detective. I can't shake the feeling that we only scratched the surface." Later that evening, Detective Lawson returned to the station, filing the necessary paperwork to expedite a search warrant. She reviewed everything Dr. Marks had reported and the strange, evasive behavior Martin had exhibited. As she prepared to submit the documentation, her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Marks. "Caroline is stable, but she's asking for you." At the hospital, Detective Lawson found Caroline awake, her frail frame propped up against the bed. Her eyes held a spark of fear, but beneath it, Lawson saw something else: determination. Caroline's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Are you going to make him leave me alone?" Lawson nodded, her gaze steady. "We're going to make sure you're safe, Caroline. No one will hurt you anymore." Caroline's hands shook as she clutched the blanket, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. He kept me there, under the house. I tried to escape once, but he said no one would believe me. He said people would just send me back to him." Lawson felt a wave of anger surge through her, but she kept her tone gentle. "You don't need to worry about that anymore. We're listening now, Caroline, and we're going to find out exactly what he did." A tear slipped down Caroline's cheek, and she quickly brushed it away. "I didn't think anyone would ever believe me. I thought I'd never get out." Lawson reached out, placing a comforting hand on Caroline's arm. "You're out now, and we're going to help you, I promise." The next day, armed with a search warrant, Detective Lawson and her team arrived at Martin Decker's sprawling estate on the outskirts of Willow Ridge. The house loomed over them, its stone walls and darkened windows casting long shadows over the yard. Lawson felt a chill as she stepped onto the property, sensing the secrets buried within its walls. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, each room meticulously arranged, with everything in its proper place. But as they descended to the basement, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down on them. The basement was dark, with a low ceiling and walls lined with cement. Lawson's flashlight swept across the room, illuminating dusty shelves filled with old tools and boxes. And then, behind a stack of crates, she spotted something. A door, almost hidden from view. She approached it cautiously, signaling her team to cover her as she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room beyond. The walls were bare concrete, and a thin mattress lay on the floor, covered in worn blankets. A faint, musty smell hung in the air. Lawson felt a surge of nausea as she realized what this room was. It wasn't just a storage area. It was a cell. In the corner, she noticed something that made her heart clench: a small, faded drawing, taped to the wall. It depicted a young girl standing in a field, her face turned toward the sun. Lawson swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what she had uncovered. "Get forensics down here," she ordered, her voice tight. "We're going to need everything." As her team began their work, Lawson turned back to the small, cold room. She couldn't imagine the years Caroline must have spent here, trapped in this bleak, lifeless space. But now, standing in the darkness, Lawson made a silent vow. She would bring Martin Decker to justice, no matter what it took. For Caroline, this was only the beginning of a long journey toward healing. But for Lawson, it was a battle, a fight to bring light to the darkness that had ruled over Caroline's life for so many years. The depths of the past. Detective Sarah Lawson lingered in the doorway of the hidden room, her stomach churning with a mix of horror and rage. She'd seen dark places before, had uncovered secrets that people buried under layers of deception, but something about this small, cold room unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite explain. She took a steadying breath and stepped into the room, her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. The forensic team moved around her, carefully photographing and cataloging every inch of the cramped space. Lawson's flashlight flickered over the walls, noting faint scratches near the bed. A tally of days or years, She couldn't be sure. They painted a haunting image of Caroline's years of captivity. For a moment, she let herself imagine what it must have been like to wake up every day in darkness, with no way out and no hope of escape. As she absorbed the scene, Lawson heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Dr. Evelyn Marks entering, her face pale as she took in the room. "I had to see it for myself," Dr. Marks murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Lawson nodded, understanding. She gestured to the small windowless room, her voice low. This was her world, Dr. Marks. This was where he kept her. Dr. Marks swallowed hard, her gaze drifting to the small, faded drawing on the wall. "It's unimaginable," she whispered. "How did she survive this?" "Survival is a strange thing," Lawson replied. "People endure what they have to. But I intend to make sure she never has to endure anything like this again." They fell silent, the weight of the room pressing down on them. Dr. Marks finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" Lawson's jaw tightened. "I'm building a case. With everything we found here, along with Caroline's testimony, we can charge Martin Decker with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and probably a dozen other crimes." She hesitated, her gaze hardening. "But we'll need to dig deeper. I want to know who this man really is." Leaving the basement, Lawson returned to the station, where she pored over Martin Decker's files, background checks, and personal records. The more she read, the more questions arose. Martin Decker had once been a respected professor of history at a nearby university. His colleagues described him as brilliant but reclusive, a man who preferred the company of books to people. Nothing in his public life suggested a man capable of such horrific abuse. She combed through every record, determined to find a lead, something to explain his motivations, his secrets. And then, buried in a file from over 30 years ago, she found it, a reference to a young woman named Evelyn Ross. Lawson's fingers traced the name, her mind racing. Evelyn Ross had been a promising student in one of Martin's classes, known for her quick wit and passion for history. But something had happened. According to the records, she'd gone missing shortly after graduating, and no one had seen or heard from her since. She pulled out the file, feeling a creeping sense of dread. The police at the time had dismissed her disappearance as a case of a young woman seeking adventure, maybe traveling somewhere far from the expectations of small-town life. But in light of what she knew about Martin now, Lawson wondered if there was a darker story hidden beneath the surface. Digging further, she discovered letters Evelyn had written to friends before she disappeared, letters filled with fear and desperation. Evelyn had written about feeling followed, about someone watching her. In one letter, she'd mentioned her professor by name, saying she felt suffocated by his attention, that he had a strange way of knowing her every move. Lawson sat back, her mind spinning. Evelyn Ross had been Martin's first victim. She was almost certain of it. The next morning, Lawson arranged for another meeting with Caroline. When she entered Caroline's hospital room, she found her sitting up in bed, looking stronger but still haunted. "Caroline," Lawson began gently, "I need to ask you about something. Do you remember your grandfather ever mentioning someone named Evelyn?" Caroline's eyes widened, her face paling. She nodded slowly. I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remember hearing him talk about her when I was little. He'd tell me stories about her, but it always felt strange, like he was telling me things about himself, not just about her." Lawson leaned in closer, sensing the importance of Caroline's words. "What do you mean, Caroline?" Caroline swallowed, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her blanket. "He said she was special, that she was someone who understood him. But then he'd talk about how she'd betrayed him, that she'd left him, and that it was all her fault." Lawson felt a chill settle over her. "Do you know what happened to her?" Caroline shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, but he would say things sometimes, things that made me think she never left at all." Lawson's heart pounded. She knew she was on the brink of uncovering something far darker than she'd initially suspected. She placed a comforting hand on Caroline's shoulder. "You're doing great, Caroline. You're helping us piece this together." Caroline looked at her, her expression pleading. "You won't let him get away with this, will you?" Lawson met her gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I promise you, he won't get away with it. Not this time." As the investigation deepened, Lawson's team began to uncover disturbing details about Martin's history. Friends and family members described him as a man obsessed with control, with keeping things and people exactly where he wanted them. His students remembered him as brilliant but intimidating, a man who demanded absolute respect. And then they discovered the journals. Hidden in Martin's study, beneath a floorboard, were stacks of leather-bound journals dating back decades. Each journal was filled with meticulous notes, daily entries cataloging Martin's thoughts, his emotions, his obsessions. Lawson's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading his increasingly paranoid and controlling thoughts. She read entry after entry describing his need for control, his frustration with the outside world, and his desire for companionship on his own terms. Then the entries took a darker turn. He began writing about the plan, his idea of building a sanctuary, a place where he could mold someone into his perfect vision of loyalty. The final journal contained chilling entries written about Caroline, detailing her purpose, his ownership over her, and his pride in his creation. Lawson felt her stomach twist with each word. She couldn't read anymore. Back at the hospital, Caroline sat alone in her room, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her blanket. She felt a strange mix of relief and terror knowing that her grandfather's crimes were finally coming to light. But as the days passed, her sense of dread grew. She couldn't escape the feeling that somehow he would find a way to reach her. And then, late one evening, she saw him. He stood outside her window, his face barely visible in the dim light, but she knew it was him. He stared at her, his eyes cold and unfeeling, a look of accusation and fury in his gaze. She pressed the call button frantically, her heart pounding as the nurse rushed in. By the time anyone looked outside, Martin was gone. The sighting left Caroline rattled, her sleep plagued with nightmares. She couldn't shake the image of his face, of the hatred in his eyes. Dr. Marks and Detective Lawson doubled her security detail, assuring her that he couldn't reach her. But Caroline knew better. She knew her grandfather would stop at nothing to get her back, to reclaim his possession. The next morning, Lawson was called in to review security footage, searching for any trace of Martin's visit. She pored over the tapes, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, desperate to find evidence that would put him behind bars. And then she saw it, a shadowy figure near Caroline's window, the unmistakable form of Martin Decker lurking just beyond the hospital's reach. Lawson's anger boiled over. She knew Martin wouldn't give up, wouldn't allow Caroline to escape his grasp so easily. He saw her as his creation, his possession. But Lawson also knew that she held the power to stop him. Taking a deep breath, she turned to her team. "We're going to find him. And this time, he's not slipping through our fingers." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Martin Decker had more horrors hidden away, more secrets buried in the dark places of his life. She had vowed to uncover every last one of them, no matter what it took. And now, as she prepared to track him down, she felt that familiar chill settle over her once again. This time, the hunt was on. The predator's grip. Detective Sarah Lawson's determination was like steel as she assembled her team for a manhunt. With each passing hour, the danger surrounding Caroline grew, and Lawson knew that Martin Decker was still lurking, his shadow stretching far beyond the walls of the hospital. Every instinct told her that Martin wouldn't let Caroline slip through his grasp easily. He was relentless, a predator who had staked his claim, and she couldn't ignore the intensity of his obsession. The search team fanned out, distributing images of Martin to local precincts, neighboring towns, and major transit stations. Martin's connections and wealth would be his biggest assets, so Lawson needed to move quickly, ensuring he couldn't escape the net they were casting. As she combed through Martin's digital records, his property deeds and financial accounts, she realized how carefully he'd insulated himself, avoiding scrutiny and protecting his dark secret for decades. As she and her team scanned through Martin's life, Lawson received a phone call from Caroline's room. She immediately picked up, and Dr. Marks's voice crackled on the other end, her tone tense. "Detective Lawson, you need to get here right away." "Caroline." She's remembered something. When Lawson arrived at the hospital, Caroline was sitting up in bed, her face pale but resolute. Dr. Marks stood beside her, holding her hand in silent support. Caroline looked at Lawson with a mix of fear and urgency, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "Caroline," Lawson said gently, "Dr. Marks mentioned you've remembered something." Caroline nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "There's another place," she began, her voice shaking. "He had another place where he'd take me sometimes. I'd be blindfolded, but I remember the smell of the sea and the sound of waves. It was quieter than our house." Lawson's heart pounded. "Do you remember anything else about this place?" Caroline closed her eyes, focusing. It felt empty, like no one else was there but him and me. "I don't know where it was, but I remembered he called it his retreat. He said it was where he could be alone and think." Detective Lawson's mind raced. This retreat could be a crucial lead. She turned to Dr. Marks. "Thank you for calling me in. Caroline, you've done incredibly well. We're going to find this place, and we're going to keep you safe." Leaving the room, Lawson immediately relayed the information to her team. "Search his property records, any cabin, house, or land near the coastline. I want every last detail on any real estate Martin Decker has ever owned." A junior officer soon returned with results. "There's a small cabin registered in his name, about an hour's drive from the city, right along the coast. It's isolated. The nearest property is miles away. It was originally purchased under a business alias, but later transferred to Martin's name." Lawson didn't hesitate. "Let's go. If he's hiding there, we're taking him down." The drive to the coast was tense, the sound of the squad car's engine merging with the rhythmic pounding of her heart. The sea air grew colder as they neared the cabin, and fog had settled over the coastline, shrouding the area in a bleak gray haze. The cabin came into view, a small weathered structure nestled among tall pines, its windows dark and ominous. Lawson and her team approached cautiously, weapons drawn. They moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the thick pine needles carpeting the forest floor. Lawson held up a hand, signaling them to stop. She scanned the perimeter, her sharp gaze taking in every detail, every shadow. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. Lawson's heart quickened. She gestured for her team to cover her as she entered the cabin. Inside, the cabin was eerily quiet. Dust coated the surfaces, but recent footprints marred the floor. She moved through the narrow hallway, her flashlight sweeping over walls lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. Then, in the far corner of the room, she saw it. A bed and a chain bolted to the wall, with a cuff dangling from its end. Lawson's jaw clenched, rage filling her as she imagined the horror Caroline must have endured here. This cabin was a prison, another one of Martin's carefully hidden lairs. She moved further into the room, noting personal items strewn about. A comb, an old blanket, a pile of books. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a rustling sound outside. She froze, signaling her team. She edged toward the window, peering out cautiously. A figure moved among the trees, slipping through the fog with practiced stealth. It was him, Martin Decker, his hunched frame gliding through the shadows, making his way toward the cabin. Lawson's heart pounded as she crept to the back door, signaling to her team to surround him. She moved silently, her weapon at the ready. As Martin stepped into the clearing, his eyes fixed on the cabin, Lawson sprang from the shadows, her voice ringing out. "Martin Decker, put your hands where I can see them." Martin stopped, his face twisting in surprise, then contempt. He raised his hand slowly, his eyes narrowed. "Detective Lawson," he sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "I'm afraid you've overstepped." Lawson kept her weapon trained on him, her voice calm and steady. "You're under arrest, Martin. You can't hide anymore." Martin's expression shifted, his gaze growing cold and calculating. "You think you know me," he said, his voice softening. "You think you've uncovered everything. But you're just scratching the surface, Detective." Lawson didn't flinch. "Save it. You're finished." As her team cuffed him and led him to the car, Martin's eyes met Lawson's, filled with a twisted satisfaction. "You can't protect her forever," he murmured, his voice carrying a chilling finality. Lawson watched as they loaded him into the back of the police car, feeling a flicker of doubt. Even in custody, Martin's confidence unnerved her, as if he held secrets that she had yet to uncover. Back at the station, Martin remained silent, refusing to answer any questions or acknowledge Caroline's accusations. He stared at the detectives with a cool indifference, his gaze shifting between them as if he were silently calculating his next move. Lawson pushed him, questioned him, tried every tactic in her arsenal, but he remained tight-lipped, offering nothing but a faint, mocking smile. After hours of interrogation, Lawson returned to her desk, exhausted but unwilling to give up. She needed more leverage, something that would finally shatter Martin's defenses. And then she remembered the journals. She retrieved them from the evidence locker, flipping through the pages once more. In one of the last entries, she found a passage that stopped her cold. It was dated only a few months earlier, and it described a plan, a vision Martin had cultivated over years. He wrote about his work with Caroline, about his belief that he was training her, preparing her for something greater. But what truly unnerved Lawson were his last words. "She'll never truly be free. Not as long as I live." Lawson's mind raced. This was no ordinary case of captivity. Martin saw himself as a twisted architect, a man who believed he held an almost divine right over Caroline's life. She knew she had to tread carefully. Martin's fixation was too deep, too dangerous. If she didn't handle this correctly, he could manipulate the legal system, find loopholes, or, worse yet, secure a plea deal that would allow him to control Caroline's life from within prison walls. The days that followed were tense. The prosecution built a case meticulously, ensuring every detail. Every piece of evidence was irrefutable. Caroline's testimony, though painful, became central. Dr. Marks and Detective Lawson worked closely with her, helping her prepare to face Martin in court. Caroline's strength amazed them both, her resolve unbroken despite everything she had endured. On the day of the hearing, Martin's cold stare was fixed on Caroline as she took the stand, his gaze unblinking and unrepentant. But Caroline didn't falter. She spoke clearly, her voice steady, recounting her years of confinement, the horrors she endured, the psychological torment Martin inflicted on her. As she described the years spent in darkness, her voice only wavered once, but she never looked away. Lawson watched Martin's face, waiting for any sign of remorse or regret, but saw nothing. He sat with an expression of almost detached satisfaction, as if watching a play he had directed. When the judge read his sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a faint smirk crossed his face, a look of defiance that chilled everyone in the courtroom. But Caroline's face softened with a quiet, profound relief. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her past begin to lift. Martin Decker, the man who had controlled her life, was gone. As they left the courthouse, Dr. Marks walked beside Caroline, her arm around her shoulders, offering words of comfort. Detective Lawson watched them go, feeling a sense of satisfaction mingled with sadness. The darkness Caroline had endured would take years to overcome, but today, a small part of her nightmare had finally ended. Martin Decker would live out the rest of his days behind bars, and Caroline was free. But as Lawson left the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that his shadow still lingered, a testament to the damage he had wrought. She could only hope that Caroline would find the strength to move forward, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her.